There we go. So my first question for the group is, and you can use the little reaction signs down at the bottom of your screen. How many of you have looked at the Wall Street Journal online today or in paper today? I saw one hand, but we have a lot of people with no cameras on. You can enter it in the chat if you'd like. So my question for the group is, what do we think is the most compelling issue in the front page of the Wall Street Journal today? Any takers? We can put it in the chat, or you can chime in.
Someone said banks, core values of America.
Okay. Keep going. Let's see if we can get closer to what matters. Not that these things don't matter. Any takers? So I see the CHIPS Act restrictions as an issue. CHIPS Act restrictions meaning we're ready to make big investments in semiconductor chips in the U.S., recognizing that there's an international supply chain issue and a reliance on overseas providers. But companies are recognizing that they may not want to sign up for the restrictions that come with taking that federal money. And so we've seen it before with airline industries, for example, where not everybody took COVID money during COVID for transportation issues. And if those companies are not on board with the idea of what's in the CHIPS Act, to restore an American capability, industrial-based capability, then what we have is a conflict of priorities in that those companies are operating in a capitalist environment where they need to respond to shareholders and demonstrate that they're providing value for that investment. So there may be more work to do on the CHIPS Act. It is being touted quite significantly. You see the president is on a 20-state tour starting today. I think he's in North Carolina, where he's talking about all the great things that have great investments that are being made by the federal government. The second top issue, in my view, was what's happening in Israel. And while that may seem like it's far away, I think we see something similar unfolding in Georgia, although it hasn't risen to the level of people taking to the streets yet, in that the judiciary is somewhat under attack by the legislature in Georgia. And that's sort of what's happening in Israel, where there's a question about the balance of the power within or among the branches of government. What could that mean if a democracy experiences that sort of turbulence on the international stage? I think we have yet to recognize the fragility of our democracy. So I know that sounds a little high-minded and high order, well above the discussion of a defense budget, but these conditions affect how people participate in government. And whether it's the citizens or whether it's the lawmakers, we all have frames of reference. And it's just something to be mindful of. For those that did not raise their hand about reading the Wall Street Journal, I would commend it as the primary source of unbiased news. Now, I would distinctly separate the op-ed section of the Wall Street Journal. That is distinctively right-leaning. But among U.S. press, Wall Street Journal, I think, is the most balanced. There are others, but sometimes we can't necessarily see what the bias is right at the time of presentation. We might see it in retrospect, but I encourage you to consider what your news sources are. How many know how many rounds of voting it took in the House for Speaker McCarthy to be elected? This happened in January. We can enter it in the chat. I see
John
8.
said 8.
I see too many. I see 13, 17, 13, 15. 15 is the winner. 15 is the winner. Now, I will say this is a well-educated audience, and you are distinct from most of your fellow citizens in that most people don't really care. And at the end of the day, does it matter? Well, it might matter, and we'll talk about how it might matter. But I happened to be in Las Vegas at the Consumer Electronics Show as that vote was happening. It was convenient for me to watch the entire thing on C-SPAN. I thought it was actually riveting television, and I usually joke about C-SPAN being riveting. But for those that watched it live, something different that we saw at the time was that the C-SPAN cameras were free to move around. And it's because at the time, the rules of the House had not yet been reaffirmed as the start of the new Congress. And so cameras were allowed to tilt and pan and zoom in. And we saw a lot of activity among lawmakers that we don't typically see through the sterile fixed position C-SPAN camera. And one of the things we saw was the holdout of several pretty far right House members who wanted some concessions to be provided on behalf or in exchange for their vote for McCarthy to be Speaker of the House. And some of those concessions were not extreme concessions. they were very normal things that most any citizen would say, well, yeah, why is that even in question? They were things like, we want normal order of legislation moving from its state of introduction through committee and then onto the floor for a vote. That seems like a pretty reasonable thing. The reason it became an issue or something that had to be extracted as a concession was because over time, Congress has drifted away from that concept called regular order. And as a result, the big deals at the end of the fiscal years are being made in the back room, and the rank and file members, and in many cases, committee members of even very powerful committees were not having a say. And they had a problem with that, and they thought there should be extractions made. Now, there were other concessions, and there were things that didn't make a written list that we are continuing to learn about, and they will unfold in due time here. So the strength of Speaker McCarthy's position is yet to be determined because it has yet to be really tested with a big issue, and so we haven't moved anything substantial through Congress yet. We haven't had any cliffs or deadlines or suspensions of activity or threats of closure. Some of the big things that can grind the process to a halt, where a speaker really needs to be able to step in and demonstrate leadership of a caucus and of the chamber. So I only bring that up just so that you're thinking about that in some way, that if you thought that it doesn't really matter, the number of rounds of votes doesn't really matter. It was highly unusual. I think that should be taken in context. But the test of the strength of that position, I think will unfold here before our eyes in the coming few months. We do have a divided government, meaning that the House and the Senate are led by two different parties. I'm going to review some findings of a Penta survey. This is a company that renamed itself. It used to be the Ballast Survey, where they surveyed congressional staff. And the idea is when you interview congressional staff, sometimes you're getting the unfiltered version of what's really going on. If you ask members to answer a survey, it gets answered with a very specific ideological lens ascribed to it. So the breakdown of the House and Senate, we're at 222 Republicans, 213 Democrats in the House. That margin of majority is 218. That's the magic number. So we're only I don't do public math. 222 versus 213. We're not far from 218 on either side. So either party needs the other to make really big things happen. Because if you look at the makeup of the Republican majority, not unlike the Democratic Party, there are differences about how strongly people feel about certain issues. And we'll talk about what some of those issues might be. On the Senate side, the balance of power, 51 Democrats, 49 Republicans. For most things, it's not a simple 50 vote or 51 vote threshold. For many things, it's a 60 vote threshold, and that's based on the need to file for cloture. Cloture is a legislative process that brings debate to a close. A couple of big things that did happen in 2022 that give some sign of hope. The CHIPS and Science Act and the Respect for Marriage Act were both passed with bipartisan votes. When you look at what are the issues within Congress, the Republicans and Democrats, again, this is a survey of staffs, they see the economy as the top issue. Both parties, Republican and Democrat. The last issue, and this is of 12 issues, the one that with the least support in both parties, were DEI and justice issues. Maybe a little disappointing for some, but it does show there are a lot of things on the table, and not everything can be a priority. In fact, defense and national security did not rank in the top 12 issues when staff were asked, what are the big things? Where is the widest gap between the parties? When you look at infrastructure and transportation, Democrats see it one way, Republicans see it another. So some of these things that are in front of us to be worked on, may pass more easily than others. Both parties see labor as the biggest issue. I said the economy, but as an element of the economy, what's driving that is labor. And access to labor is one piece of it. Access to skilled labor is probably a more important piece. And I know parts of the defense industry are seeing this very, very acutely. And it's an issue that we're seeing some legislative steps taken and funding applied over the last couple of years to try to reignite or restore some capacity that's been lost in the industrial base and the defense industrial base in particular. When you look at the review of what is the media covering in DC throughout 2022, I'll just highlight a couple of issues here. And again, these are just sort of framing concepts for you. Early in the year, Ukraine was the dominant issue, but that rapidly dropped off over the course of the summer. And by the end of the year, Ukraine was actually pretty low on the media profile. The abortion issue, when the Dobbs case came up in the Supreme Court, that peaked in May, June timeframe. It's now dropped way off again. The economy has been probably the most steady, most talked about issue among DC media. So again, talking about recession and inflation. COVID was pretty high at the beginning of the year, and then it steadily dropped off. There's a slight peak in the, where was that? I'm looking at my list here. A slight peak in the April timeframe, but then it has dropped off dramatically. Climate has been at the bottom consistently. I offer that just as a context for what is the DC News reporting. When I raised the question about the speaker vote, the first test of that is actually unfolding as we speak, and that's on the debt limit. The debt limit is something that has to be addressed. I always think it's kind of a crazy debate because we're arguing over, are we going to fund what legislation we have already passed as funding, as approved funding? So we have approved funding that's out there, and now it's time to pay for it. And now we're asking the question, are we going to raise the debt limit in order to pay for what we said we wanted? we can all have our opinion on this. This is testing the speaker right now, and it just started over the weekend. The chairman of the House Budget Committee was trying to float sort of a template, a soft balloon, what you might call it, of how will things unfold? What should the parameters of the budget be? And Speaker McCarthy said on national television, I don't know what he's talking about. That is not a good sign that the chairman of that committee and the speaker are not on the same page, especially out in public like that. I would call that a rebuke by the speaker in no uncertain terms. And, we'll see how long the chairman of the budget committee stays in position. This seems to be a tool that this current form of the Republican Party is not afraid to use to take people from seats. We'll see. But the debt limit has to be dealt with as just a fundamental piece of how our government conducts business. I mentioned the economy as a persistent issue when viewed through the lens of the DC media. There's two elements to that in my view, both inflation and recession. Inflation, some of those on the call here are old enough to remember when we actually had to pay to borrow money. But we have C-suite leaders who've been in position for 15 years who have had access to pretty much free money. We've printed money. When the government says they're using extraordinary means to control inflation, that means they're printing money. And that's what they do. They don't say it like that, but that's what's happening. Leaders of companies have been able to get money at very, very low interest rates or no interest rate in order to make investment. And now companies are feeling the pain of what does it feel like when you have to pay for that and pay based on the market conditions. I went to college at a time when low interest student loans were only 7%. Now that was back in the 80s. I think the recession that is being discussed is nothing like that recession. It's also nothing like the recession of 2008. The recession that is unfolding, if it's even a recession, is not affecting the economy evenly. And in fact, there was a time in 2022 where we did experience what is technically a recession, in that is 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth. That was not called a recession. So some of this is just about how do we want to label it and look at it, and how do we feel about it. Inflation is a real thing, in that there's a number tied to it. Recession has a psychological aspect to it, and Jimmy Carter used to refer to the concept of a general malaise that was overtaking the country's mindset. Well, there's something to that, in that if the haves and the have-nots are seeing the clear disparities, there's an issue with that. COVID revealed some pretty serious fractures in our economic well-being, and how society either does well or doesn't do well, depending on where you sit. Inflation and the concept of recession are with us. I'm not here to forecast. I just say take it in context. We've had much worse conditions. We've had better conditions. Certain parts of the economy are doing quite well. Others are struggling to adapt. So the budget was released about a month late, the FY24 budget. This is a normal time of year for that to happen. It is technically due to Congress by the first Monday in February every year. For the last several years, that has not happened on time. This year we were 30 or so days late. One can ask, why is that? It's not like it was a new president in office. I don't have a good reason, and it didn't seem to me that the administration had a good reason. There was no dramatic time bomb, so to speak, of news that came with the delivery of the FY24 budget. For those that have not seen the defense version of it, way up at the beginning of the chat, I dropped in a website that some I'm sure know about and go to regularly. It's called the Comptroller Defense website. If you Google FY24 budget materials, it will be among the first pages that shows up. The services have now posted their version of the defense bill, but you can get to every part of the public defense bill from that one DoD Comptroller website. If that's news to you, you need to dig into these documents a little bit. Some of you use it regularly, I'm sure. There are by account, so procurement, research and development, operations and maintenance, just some examples. Within each service, those are further broken down. And the beauty of these documents is that they are searchable, meaning you can take your program name at whatever level, or a program line number, or a program element number, and you can type it into the search box and it will take you right to the document. And immediately what you see is what's been requested at the top level for that program. You'll see what was enacted the prior year and what was enacted the year prior to that. So you can see some trend data for the procurement and R&D sections. There's also backup data that appears behind those pages that makes up what are known as justification books, J books. Some of those are not completely publicized yet, but they will be. Those are due to Congress within days of the delivery of the budget. Congressional staff are receiving them now. But in those documents, you can see in even much greater detail what future projections look like. Where is a particular line of effort going to evolve over the next year or year plus? Sometimes there are geographic locations named by name. Sometimes companies are named by name when it's an existing program, so that they can demonstrate to Congress, where these activities take place. Again, many of you are looking at these documents, but if you're not, you should be. I've also put in the chat a Dropbox link to some Adobe files, which are the unfunded priority lists for each of the services. Those became public over the last couple of days. That is a list that is requested by the Defense Committee leadership of each military service, where they ask, hey, if you had more funding, what would you spend it on? And there's some gamesmanship here in that services don't always get what they want in the budget. It's a fight at the very high level, and you have to be able to justify your need and your requirement. You need to prioritize your funding. Say the services need to do this, and sometimes they're able to do so with great success. But it usually requires some preparation of the battlefield, so to speak, and that means using third-party advocacy, which takes the form of magazine articles, op-ed pieces, think tanks writing and speaking, Congress communicating at hearings, questions being asked at hearings about how things should unfold for a particular service. Sometimes you'll see public comments, and I'm going to talk about a few of them here shortly, from senior officials that are either perfectly aligned with that public budget or that show some questions about things that they lost in the backroom deal when it got up to OSD or when it went to the Office of Management and Budget. When the budget, this would have been back in the November, December timeframe, when it went from OSD to OMB, there are always some back and forths about the big muscles. Sometimes there have to be changes made so that funding can be applied to maybe some other non-defense issue in another department of government. Those decisions are made at OMB. So sometimes things fall out at the last minute. But having familiarity with what's published, so what's publicly requested. This budget now is going to Congress. It's in Congress being evaluated, and by its nature, it's a political document. So it came from a political administration, I know the Defense Department believes it has studied this problem of national security exhaustively and that they've come to the best solution. Congress will not be convinced of that, and they'll need to be convinced of that. And the way that that happens is through hearings. Hearings are taking place right now as we speak. This week, Secretary Austin and General Milley are on the Hill. They'll be defending their budget in what's called a posture hearing. And that is a specific opportunity for the strategic elements of the budget to be spoken to, challenged by defense committees. Remember, there are 4 defense committees, 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate, authorizations and appropriations for each. And they lead to 2 defense bills at the end of this process, a National Defense Authorization Act and then a defense appropriations bill. I'm going to talk about some of the public statements that are out there. I just want to see if we want to use the reactions feature. A quick show of hands. Did anybody attend the Jim McAleese annual seminar he puts on along with Credit Suisse? It occurred about a week or so ago. I don't see any hands going up. Anybody in the chat, Brittany, that responded to that? I'm not.
I had 1 thumbs up that I saw, and then someone said they did virtually.
Good. So Jim McAleese is an extremely well-respected analyst of national security. He is superb at reporting the news. He doesn't attempt to predict the news. He reports what's happening, and he has uncommonly good relationships with administrations, Republican and Democrat, and he's able to bring public officials to what is a nonpartisan discussion of national security priorities every year. This year was extremely unfortunate that as Credit Suisse was collapsing in Switzerland, it was about the day of the event here. I know there was some underwriting support by Credit Suisse. I don't know what that relationship will be going forward. This is not an advertisement for any underwriter of Jim McAleese, but I suspect we will see a continuation of this. It's been in motion for a number of years. But what happens is when the budget is delivered, there is usually some fairly limited press that takes place. But it's orchestrated press. So the secretary, the senior members of DoD leadership, the comptroller, the J8 and the Joint Staff, and then service chiefs do a pretty short brief to the public to sort of reveal this budget and what their priorities are. And then the fun sort of begins, where we start to see disconnects in what's written versus what gets said, and what did they mean by that. So I'm just going to highlight a couple of things that jumped out at me in some review of some recent public statements here. Chairman Rob Whitman is the chairman of the Tactical Air Land Forces on the House Armed Services Committee. China is the existential threat. Divest to invest is not the strategy. Stop the CRs, continuing resolutions. Okay, those are all pretty common drumbeats. China is something we're hearing a lot about. Divest to invest is certainly one that's been used by Navy, but it's been used by all services over time to say, hey, we need to stop spending money on old equipment. We need to get new stuff, and to get new stuff, you need to get rid of old stuff because it costs a lot to maintain. We'll talk a little more about it. Something Chairman Whitman said that jumped out at me was that DIU, the Defense Innovation Unit out in California, should be a direct report to the Secretary of Defense. Does anybody remember the Chevy Vega from the 1970s? The Chevy Vega was designed by General Motors, not Chevrolet. It was a disaster. There's a reason that the Secretary of Defense is not in programmatics and R&D. They are the Secretary of Defense. This is my opinion. I think that's just crazy talk. We are of a confused mind about what Silicon Valley and DIU can do for us, and I'll talk a little more about this. Senator Joni Ernst, a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee, had a few comments. lethality is what truly counts. China and Russia are now cooperating. China intends to dominate the U.S. economically and militarily. It could well be that is what's happening. But I think we'll see that there are differences in DoD's view of China versus the rest of the world's view of China. Secretary Gates, former Secretary of Defense, said that we have, in our attempt to predict what the future engagement will be, we've been wrong 100% of the time. I think that's pretty wise counsel, that we may not understand what's the next threat. Though if you were to listen to most anybody talking about defense, they'll frame it around China. Senator Ernst points out that we have lost about $14 billion in purchasing power due to the effects of inflation. I'm not an economist. I don't know that that's an accurate number. I do know that DoD failed miserably at using a realistic inflation figure when they presented FY23 and FY24 budgets. FY23 caught everyone off guard because there was really no calculation. That was a political calculation made by the administration at the time, knowing that Congress would fix it. And they did. They added $45 billion at the end of the day. That's a ballpark figure, but about that much was added. That was about 9%. Moving into some of what uniform people are saying, the head of Transcom, General Van Oost, China will target U.S. logistics because 85% of U.S. combat power is in CONUS. So that does kind of make sense to me, but that's the perspective of the head logistician responsible for moving troops and equipment around the world in the event of a conflict. Curiously, the Army has 6 operational imperatives. This, according to Secretary Wormuth. These are all public. I can breeze through them super quickly here. See and sense further. Mass disperse forces with combat. Win with fires and fight, or win the fires fight. Protect against air, missile, and drones. Communicate and share data rapidly, and sustain and fight across long distances. Those are 6 imperatives. Further, the Army has 5 missions. So how many priorities can you have? So 5 missions are: establish secure forward staging bases, long distance sustainment, provide command and control, ground-based long-range fire, and maneuver forces for counterattack. There's a lot there. So that's 11 priorities that I counted. Army Chief of Staff takes it even further. 4 factors of winning: capability and lethality, capacity, competence, and the will to fight. Capability and lethality was 1, so there were 4 there, but he snuck a 5th one in. Going to skip over. You can see I'm reading notes because there's just so much information here. But these are things to consider that can get by you if you're only reading the headlines. Some might have heard Secretary LaPlante, the Undersecretary of Defense for Acquisition and Sustainment, a couple of weeks ago. Might have been a month or so ago. He said, "Hey, I don't need any help from the tech bros." That quote was that stuck to him like glue. In that it was viewed as very disparaging from the perspective of the commercial investment that they're so badly in need of from the folks in Silicon Valley and beyond. But the top issue that the plant talks about of late, so within the last week, is Ukraine security assistance. That's about $32 billion as of today. And munitions. You're going to hear munitions a few times here. There is a Ukraine Munitions Industrial Task Force. I know we have some people who focus on munitions on the call here. That's one to take a look at. Secretary Hsu, Undersecretary for Research and Engineering, a well-respected person in the world of acquisition, arguing that we need to be absorbing commercial technologies. You've heard of the Valley of Death if you've been around DoD for any amount of time. The Valley of Death is that big gap that exists between the SBIR phases and then getting to an actual program of record. What we're seeing is a defense apparatus reaching for funding mechanisms to try to fill that valley of death, as opposed to changing how we introduce R&D capability. So we're looking to fund the valley of death as opposed to fill the valley of death. I find that somewhat curious. There's an Office of Strategic Capital that's been established as of this year that is intended to try to find ways for commercial money to be available to companies who have demonstrated capability at the more advanced SBIR phases, say a phase 3. But it's really creative financing that's got government backing. Heidi Shyu was talking about CHIPS funding over the next 5 years, consistent with the investment that President Biden is touting and trying to generate additional support for. Air Force perspective, Secretary Kendall, China, and that China will try to deliberately block U.S. attempts at force projection. Divest to invest is not accurate. This is, again, Secretary Kendall. For those that work in the tanker world, it's no longer about how to get to a new tanker. It's about how to recapitalize the KC-135. So that's one example of we're not divesting. We're trying to extend. You might have seen an example in the Navy of a service life extension plan on DDG 51. It's a way to add a few more years of service life to what is a 30-year-old ship. Typically, ships are built to last 30 years and can be extended to 40, and you get into issues of metallurgy that prevent you from going further. From Spacecom, General Saltzman, China and Russia want to blind or destroy U.S. sensors. Secretary Del Toro, Secretary of the Navy, $32 billion shipbuilding request. So that's the SCN account. That's the largest we've ever had. Navy has consistently said that, hey, industry can't build any more ships. If we throw more money at this problem, we need more capacity. I think that's a question mark when you talk to the shipyards. They question, are we building the right ships to begin with? But they don't speak with a collective voice very well. Publicly, SecNav is saying that the budget request is adequate. That's not what his chief of naval operations is saying. There's a public number of 355 ship Navy. We are not on track to meet that anytime soon. The shipbuilding plan that's been submitted, it's an annual requirement, and the last year the Navy submitted a plan that had 3 options on it. It didn't submit a singular plan, and so it landed in Congress with a thud, and Congress continues to fund shipbuilding at the pace and direction that it sees fit. General Berger of the Marine Corps, he's speaking quite consistently about the need for 31 amphibious warships, presenting that in the context of a China fight. He sees a need for 6 deployed amphibious groups at any one time among U.S. and allies, and that sends the clear message that China needs to see that we're ready to go tonight. That fight tonight is a theme that uniformed people like to speak to. It's a legitimate rationale. If you're not ready to go tonight, when are you ready? You can't always have that ramp up to an engagement. I think people are aware that there's been a general pullback from Japan in terms of our basing strategy and sustainment strategy, and that there's been a significant buildup on Guam over the last 10 plus years, and that continues to accelerate. And industry is finding its way to Guam as well to try to have arrangements in place should there be a long distance fight. From the Naval Supply Systems Command, this is the head supply person, Admiral I'm going to mess it up. Vanessa's going to kill me here. Stamatopoulos. I'm hoping that I got close there. A contested logistics fight will be the issue. I'm not steeped in the military plans for the Pacific fight, but it's public knowledge that our success there, should it come to that, does include losing capital ships. Some might have seen the 60 Minutes program the other night, where the Navy was very public and very direct about what they're preparing for, why we need a Navy, and what it means. What should it come to a China fight? The rationale of something like that is that why be on 60 Minutes? So they were volunteers there. It wasn't like 60 Minutes showed up in their office unannounced, like they might have in the 70s or 80s. The citizens of America are not prepared for that sort of a high-end fight. And so it's a first step at trying to communicate clearly that there is a real threat here. From my view, the challenge is that we're wildly inconsistent with how we're talking about it. We're talking about it today in the context of the Department of Defense, but there's much, much more to it. And the commercial world is not there. At the top of the program here, I talked about the CHIPS Secure Act, and companies have conflicting values, and not all of them are as purely aligned to what are the American strategic priorities. What I notice missing in the public discourse on the budget right now is any discussion of a digital environment, and it's probably one of the most profound changes that's happening right before our eyes. I have some exposure to it through some clients, but not deep exposure. But I recognize that the system is failing us in that we have a process that is grinding its way through new ideas. It's difficult to bring new concepts forward. The technology in the digital world is changing far faster than the budget process can keep up. And so the way to combat that at this place we're in is to try to use Congress to short circuit some of those cumbersome processes. I see that this is rapidly crippling our system. There's a lot of talk about zero trust. There's a lot of talk about hoping to get to a new place using great technologies. We want Silicon Valley, we want commercial investment, but we have to change our procedures. This is not a profound insight on my part. There's a recognized need to reform the PPVE system, the planning, programming, budgeting, and execution system. That's the system that develops those budget documents that I have put in the chat. You need to understand how that process works to know how to short circuit that process. There is a commission that's been established by Congress that consists of a lot of insiders, quite frankly. There's nobody from the outside on that commission who is evaluating how could this process be changed to make it better. I think failing to put outsiders on that commission dooms it to be an insider game again. They released an interim report here about a month or so ago, and there's a final report due at the end of this year. Its recommendations will not be enacted for, I would predict, 2 years at the earliest. It's just a very, very slow moving process. What can you be doing right now? I'm coming to the end here. Just a few procedural things that you should be thinking about. What is your communications pace with your customer? And your customer, as I always say, is not one person. It's a constellation of people across government and across industry. So that includes industry, agency, and Congress. The constellation of people have different ownership of the decisions that affect you. Some have no ownership, but you may be communicating with people thinking that you're solving a problem or advancing their understanding, and you're really talking to the wrong person. your use of terminology and your use of the correct lexicon is critical. If you get into a meeting that you've worked so hard to get and you speak using the wrong terminology, you instantly lose your credibility, and people turn away, and you don't know that you didn't have a good meeting. If you're in or out of the FY24 budget, that matters. You should know that by now. You should have known that well before the budget was published. If you didn't, that means that you don't have good customer intimacy. And that's not difficult to generate. Yes, there are rules and laws about what the government customer can say to you before something becomes public, but it is generally knowable in most cases what will be funded. So if you were surprised, maybe we could talk about how I could help you learn more about how to intuit what's happening here. Next up is a reprogramming effort for FY23. So we are executing FY23. That budget is not executing as planned for a whole host of reasons. Companies sometimes fail to deliver on cost and schedule. A technology might not have evolved the way it was expected to, and so the funding can't support it. And that means that money will be moved. Money above a certain threshold, it's $10 million is the threshold for reprogramming. Money above that number needs to be approved by 4 committees of Congress: House and Senate Armed Services, House and Senate Defense Appropriations Subcommittee. That's a challenge. And each year, about $1 billion to $2 billion in reprogramming is requested of Congress. So that means that there are opportunities for you to potentially be identified as a source of a capability that's ready to go where that funding can be applied. The service would rather spend the money on something that they need than to have to give the money back to the Treasury, which leads to sweep up funds. At the end of the fiscal year, August to September, there is one final push to get everything obligated that is within the checkbook of each of the services. Being positioned to be able to get some of that funding is a way to, again, accelerate an outcome for you by 12 months or more. There are opportunities to have conversations with people in your customer constellation about how ready you are to receive that kind of funding if it were to take place. But there's a way to ask for it. And if you don't know how to ask for it, it'll never come your way. If you ask for it incorrectly, you may send the wrong signal that you didn't intend to send. I would just point out that not everything has to be on contract by the end of the fiscal year. It just needs to be obligated by the end of the fiscal year. And some money has longer life than a single fiscal year, but money that will expire at the end of September must be obligated. And you can obligate with something as simple as a memo from a program office. And it's been done before many, many times. Sometimes at the end of the year, those contracting centers are just jammed and you can't get any more through the system. And so there's risk that something won't go on contract. So one way around that is to use a memo of support or a memo of intent from that program office. I'm going to pause there, take a sip of water, and I'm open to questions. I went a little over time, but I appreciate those that stayed. It means that there's something here that you are trying to learn. Questions? Brittany?
None so far. If you guys have questions, you can drop them in the chat.
They're not mandatory, and I won't ask you any. And if we don't have any, we won't stay. So let's give it 30 seconds. I want to know why in this day and age, so many people are not on camera. Get over it. It's a video world and the camera don't lie. I see.
Hey,
no
Gene,
question.
good presentation. I'm coming in from Atlanta Airport, so that's why you didn't see my video for a long
How are
time.
you?
Hope everybody
All
has a
right.
good one today.
You get dispensation. You have a question, Alan?
No, I was just going to compliment that you discuss the sweep up funds because so many companies aren't aware of how you can access to those. And it wasn't my direct responsibility, but we were beneficiaries of that a couple of times.
No, it's generally small dollar value opportunities, but for a lot of companies, if you're a $10 million company and you can get another $1 million at the end of the year, that can change somebody's life.
Well, what we found is if you had somebody who was willing to listen, and he just had a drawer full of ready jobs to go. So when the end of the year came around, he just opened the drawer, and we didn't wait for the end of the year to start filling that drawer.
It's good to have a couple of sugar daddies identified in the system. There are people throughout government who know how to access money and know how to tell you how to ask for it, but you have to connect to those people. All right. I guess Alan gets the last word. Brittany, thanks for being here, and to everybody on the call, thank you for joining, and we'll see you next time.